moderator, I wish to thank a number of units that contributed to the success of this event. First of all, I want to thank you, the audience, because no matter how hard the Humanities Center works and how diligently we organize, if you don't show up to our events, then nothing happens. So I thank you. I thank you all for coming. Then I want to thank the advisory board of the Humanities Center. I am a very, very lucky administrator. I have 13 very bright people who come together and help me to help the center to make decisions. And the decision to have a symposium on the theme of Read the City, what came from the advisory board, particularly David Marola from the sociology department. He was ably assisted by Alina Cherry and Emery Stevens and the entire group of advisory board members. You've been seeing them walking around with red name tags, contributed to this effort, and I thank them enormously. I thank the moderators who managed the conference so well, so that we are, and I'm spoiling it now because there's not more time than but they all, Jeffrey and Kedada and David and Shara and Elena and Sharon and Emery and Jamie, who did a fantastic job in managing the conference. I thank the keynoter, Professor Julius Wilson. We were absolutely amazed that somebody of his distinction would agree to come to talk to us for the modest reward we can offer him. In fact, when I called his office, I called with a sinking heart. I knew I was going to be rejected. And then that he agreed, and we are enormously grateful. And of course, I thank the many, many speakers, several speakers from Wayne State University, from as far as Berlin, from national universities, who came together today and made this conference a success in my opinion. I thank Melba Boyd and Don Hasse for making opening comments, and I thank the co-sponsors for this event, Africana Studies, Sociology, and Urban Studies and Planning. And lastly, but most importantly, I thank my small staff. I have just a staff of one administrative assistant, two college work study people, and 2 student assistants. And they work tremendously hard. You see them running around, doing all kinds of things while I enjoy the benefits of this success. So I want you to give a round of applause to these people: Gloria Zachary, Shamira Tellis, Rodina Peace, Lakeisha Burns, and Anisha Bat. Please give them. I invite you after the moderator will repeat his invitation to join us upstairs for a reception, but also in that reception room there will be a video on Detroit or how to rust, and then across the way, just to give you options, there is going to be a performance by Kier, who is a spoken word artist. And he will be performing in room J. So after this event, you have several options. So now I turn it over to my friend and colleague Chris for managing this session.
Okay, great. It is an honor and privilege to present our keynote speaker this afternoon, Dr. William Julius Wilson. Dr. Wilson is Louis P. and Linda L. Geisser University Professor at Harvard University. He is one of only 24 university professors, the highest professional distinction at the Harvard faculty members can receive. Dr. Wilson received his PhD from Washington State University in 1966. He held faculty positions at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and the University of Chicago. He was also the director of the University of Chicago Center for the Study of Urban Inequality. He joined Harvard in 1966. Dr. Wilson is an accomplished scholar of race, ethnic, and minority relations, urban sociology, and social policy. He has published extensively on these themes in journal articles, book chapters, and full-length books. His publications represent some of the most influential scholarship on race and urban poverty. There are two in particular that I want to draw your attention to. When I was in graduate school, these were two of the books that absolutely shaped everybody in graduate school who wanted to study urban poverty and race relations. In particular, the Truly Disadvantaged questions the relationship between race, employment, and education since the 1950s in the United States. In addition to winning several awards, The Truly Disadvantaged was named one of the 16 best books of 1987 by the editors of the New York Times Book Review. When Work Disappears, the other book, also received critical acclaim when it was published in 1996. These two books are must-reads for all graduate students who are interested in these themes that Dr. Wilson is going to speak about today. Dr. Wilson is past president of the American Sociological Association. He's received many distinctions, including more than 40 honorary degrees, the 1998 National Medal of Science, the highest scientific honor in the U.S., and the Talcott Parsons Prize in the Social Sciences. He was granted the Seidman Award in Political Economy, particularly notable because he was the first and only non-economist to win this award. He was also selected by Time magazine in 1996 as one of America's 25 most influential people. He is a dedicated public sociologist, and without a doubt, he's a leading scholar on issues of poverty in urban areas, influencing how we think about urban inequality, race and ethnic relations, joblessness, family structure, and the role of public policies in alleviating and maintaining these inequalities. The title of his presentation today is The Truly Disadvantaged Revisited: Critical Reflections on the Recent Research on Concentrated Urban Poverty. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Julius Wilson.
I'm really pleased. Oh, by the way, I joined the faculty at Harvard in 1996, not 1966.
Did it say 1966? I'm sorry.
No problem. But that was a marvelous introduction.
That was a big jump.
Is that laptop in your way?
Yeah, let me move it. So I'm pleased to, by the way, there aren't some seats, so folks don't have to stand. You want to come up and pick some?
Yeah, there's plenty of seats up here. Front row.
Right. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to address this Congress body. And my talk this afternoon comes 2 years after the 25th anniversary publication of my book, The Truly Disadvantaged. However, the economic processes emphasized in the books have continued. The loss of manufacturing jobs, the movement of jobs from cities to the suburbs and overseas, and even greater internationalization of the economy, especially through trade liberalization facilitated by free trade agreements in the 1990s. Moreover, given the expansion of low-wage jobs lacking fringe benefits and the polarization between high-wage and low-wage occupations, higher education is even more critical for social advancement in the labor market today. Furthermore, the adverse effects of deindustrialization on inner-city black employment continue to be a major problem. And by and large, the conditions described in the truly disadvantaged are not qualitatively different from more than 25 years later. Even though when I wrote the book, conditions had been in decline for roughly 15 years, that is, since the early 1970s. There are still major racial differences and concentrated poverty, and although the country experienced dramatic declines in concentrated poverty during the economic boom of the 1990s, including declines in urban black neighborhoods, since 2000 there has been a substantial increase in high poverty neighborhoods. The problems of joblessness have continued and have even gotten worse for low-skilled blacks. The racial employment disparities have persisted. The black-white unemployment ratio seemed essentially fixed at 2.0 or greater, which means that even through economic upturns and downturns, the black unemployment rate has been at least twice that of the white unemployment rate, although during the recent economic crisis, the rate dipped below 2.0 from December 2009 to March 2010 because of the sharp increase in joblessness among whites. There have also been some interesting changes that should be noted. There is greater class polarization among African Americans. The outmigration of middle-class blacks from the inner city continues, but more have moved to the suburbs, including suburban black neighborhoods. And a growing number of poor blacks now live in the suburbs rather than the cities, many in older inner ring suburbs that feature poverty rates approximating those in the inner cities. Immigration has been very consequential in reshaping cities and urban labor markets, especially low-wage labor markets. Incarceration has sharply increased in the more than 25 years since The Truly Disadvantaged was published, and it has had profound consequences for the urban black poor. There is, of course, the Great Recession and its aftermath, including the current period of long-term joblessness. These changes notwithstanding, the basic arguments in The Truly Disadvantaged are as relevant and important today as they were when it was published. And the book created a paradigm that led to hundreds of empirical studies across social science disciplines in response to my arguments, particularly those dealing with the causes and effects of increased concentrated poverty, and these included studies on neighborhood effects, economic restructuring and spatial mismatch, persistent poverty and depopulation, social isolation and concentration effects, and the male marriageable pool hypothesis. Now today I would like to briefly discuss some of the important research on neighborhood effects, a topic that has received a good deal of attention from scholars across social science disciplines. The concept of neighborhood effects refers to the impact of various social, cultural, and demographic neighborhood conditions on the residents. And the research on neighborhood effects suggests that concentrated neighborhood poverty increases the likelihood of social isolation from mainstream institutions, joblessness, dropping out of school, lower educational achievement, involvement in crime, unsuccessful behavioral development and delinquency among adolescents, non-marital childbirth, and unsuccessful family management. In general, the research reveals that concentrated neighborhood poverty adversely affects one's chances in life, beginning in infancy and lasting well into adulthood. However, some scholars have been concerned that many of these studies reach conclusions about neighborhood effects based on data that do not address the problem of self-selection bias, a term used by social scientists, especially economists, to describe the effect of people grouping themselves together based on common characteristics. These scholars argue that the effects we attribute to poor neighborhoods may instead be caused by the characteristics of families and individuals who end up living there. In other words, they feel that disadvantaged neighborhoods might not be the cause of poor outcomes, but rather that families with the weakest job-related skills, with the lowest awareness of and concern for the effects of the local environment on their children's social development, with attitudes that hinder social mobility, and with the most burdensome personal problems, are simply more likely to live in these types of neighborhoods. For example, as the economists John Quigley and Stephen Rachiel pointed out, those concerned about self-selection bias would very likely conclude that individuals with the weakest job-related skills will have chosen to locate in areas where employment access is low. For example, inner-city ghetto neighborhoods, simply because monthly rents are lower in these areas. Now, I'm pulling my hair out when all this is going on, early on. And it was extremely frustrating because these were studies conducted by very competent social scientists, especially economists. Now, the initial concerns about self-selection bias can be attributed to two widely cited and influential papers by the sociologists Christopher Jenks and Susan Mayer in 1989 and 1990, which critically reviewed the then published literature on the effects of living in poor neighborhoods, studies that came out shortly after the Julius advantage was published. Indeed, following Following the publication of the Jinks and Mayer paper, some scholars argue that neighborhood effects disappear when the researchers use appropriate statistical techniques to account for self-selection bias. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal that summarizes these studies saying there are no neighborhood effects. Now, however, in addition to their criticism of the failure of cross-sectional studies to address adequately the problem of self-selection bias, there were two other important issues that Jinks and Mayer raised in highlighting the shortcomings of these studies. First of all, at the time Jinks and Mayer wrote their papers, sophisticated longitudinal research on neighborhood effects had yet to be published. And Jinks and Mayer appropriately pointed out that the studies they reviewed ignored the issue of change. If neighborhood effects accumulate slowly, they state, measuring neighborhood characteristics at a single point in time can lead to serious measurement error. And a way to address this problem empirically, they maintain, is to conduct controlled experiments. Secondly, Jinks and Mayer pointed out that a number of the cross-sectional studies they reviewed, including those that did not reveal the presence of neighborhood effects, use empirical measures of neighborhood variables that were not theoretically based and were therefore unable to identify causality. However, since the publication of the papers by Jinks and Mayer, important studies have emerged that either feature controlled experiments or highlight longitudinal research and theoretically driven data collection. And I would like to briefly discuss these studies and then revisit the question that Jinks and Mayer originally raised about the power of neighborhood effects. When one talks about controlled experiments to gauge neighborhood effects, one immediately thinks of moving to opportunity, the MTO housing studies. The MTO experiment, a housing pilot program undertaken by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development between 1994 and 1998, was framed as a test of the arguments presented in my book, The Truly Disadvantaged, that neighborhoods really matter in the lives of poor individuals. And HUD's MTO demonstration program conducted a lottery that awarded housing vouchers to families living in public housing developments in high poverty neighborhoods in 5 cities: Boston, Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. Over 4,600 families entered the lottery, thus indicating their desire to move, and were randomly assigned to one of 3 groups. One that was awarded housing vouchers that could be used to rent in the private market in any area. One was awarded housing vouchers that were restricted to private rentals in low poverty areas. And one did not receive either voucher in the lottery and was therefore treated as a control group to be compared with the other 2 groups. The MTO interim evaluation studies were considered superior to other research on neighborhood effects because they were based on data from a randomized experimental design that eliminated the self-selection bias that, quote, had made it difficult to clearly determine the association between living in poor neighborhoods and individual outcomes, unquote. In other words, by comparing randomly selected groups with the same socio-economic characteristics, those who received vouchers, which enabled them to move, which we call the experimental groups, and those that did not receive vouchers, the control group, the MTO studies effectively removed individual self-selection as an explanation for the findings. The reports and publications on the interim evaluation, which was finalized in 2003, the interim evaluation finalized in 2003. The reports and publications provided mixed evidence for neighborhood effects when comparing the groups whose MTO vouchers were restricted to low poverty areas with the group that did not receive vouchers. On the one hand, during the 5-year period following random assignment, the MTO movers who relocated to low poverty areas were more likely to experience improvements in mental health and less likely to be obese, and girls experienced a significant reduction in risky behavior, that is, drinking, taking drugs, engaging in sex, and so on. On the other hand, research investigators found no evidence of an impact on employment rates and earnings, or of any marked improvement in the educational or physical health outcomes of children and young men. And these mixed results led some, including reporters, to question whether there really are enduring negative effects of living in poor, segregated neighborhoods. And they seem to reinforce the view among some scholars that when studies effectively control for selection bias, neighborhood effects are weak or disappear. To repeat. One of the criticisms of the MTO interim evaluations is that they really did not address the problem of the long-term effects of living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. However, in the most recent study of the effects of the MTO, the study published in the Journal of Science in the fall of 2012, the researchers were able to gauge the longer-term effects, 10 to 15 years of moving from high poverty to lower poverty neighborhoods, and these effects included significantly improved mental health and subjective well-being, that is, happiness. In fact, the findings were quite robust and provide rigorous scientific evidence for the assumption that many of us have made about the effects of living in distressed neighborhoods, neighborhoods with high violent crime rates, and other rates of social dislocation on mental health and subjective well-being. Indeed, many of the voucher holders expressed feelings of relief because of their move to less distressed neighborhoods. However, the researchers also found that although the residents perceived their new neighborhood on average to be safer, moving to these neighborhoods did not significantly affect economic self-sufficiency, for example, employment and welfare receipt. A finding that once again raises questions about the ultimate power of neighborhood effects. And this finding, however, was not really surprising to those of us familiar with the design of the MTO experiment. Although the research on the MTO experiment is rigorous, there are serious issues